Today I will be discussing the 2005 animated children's film Robots. This is not a review, but boy, do I have a lot to talk about when it comes to this movie. There's already some stuff out there on the internet about this movie, people making all kinds of bold claims. Anyone who is going to make a bold claim about this movie is probably pandering for your likes. The reality is that this movie, along with most modern mainstream films, and most modern kids' movies especially, have conflicting influences and interests and are complicated. There's a lot of things going on. A lot of different people, a lot of different companies went into producing these things for a lot of different reasons. That, of course, intersects with genuine creative interest, with a genuine interest in, educating kids and entertaining them and such. But man, it's a complicated product that comes out at the end of the day, always. So I'm not going to be making really bold claims, but I will be touching on a ton of very interesting themes. And I think just trying to ease into some of these ideas. The main ideas, I think, for this movie, for me at least, one, different types of futurism that are on show, absurdism and the absurdist logic of the film, toys, a lot about toys, mimicry and the hyper-real, the body, gender, the right to repair, and the proletariat, and finally, Disney. So I'm going to be touching on all of those things, but what better place to start than the beginning of the film? So the movie opens panning across Rivet Town. Rivet Town immediately evokes a bit of an industrial legacy, a Midwestern kind of feel, perhaps a small town, an industrial town. Let's bookmark the industrial legacy, and we'll come back to it. As we pan across the town, we get a bunch of jokes, basically, to open up with. We see a movie theater, we see Auntie Free's ice cream stand, and we see a barber shop. Now, why would a robot need a barber? Would a robot have hair that grows that needs to be trimmed, right? We see a robot feeding the pigeons, feeding robot pigeons, in fact. Why would there be, in a world of robots, why would there be robotic pigeons? It's not clear. This is our introduction to the absurdist nature of this film. These jokes are funny because they strike at inefficiency, essentially, right? Robots that do not make sense. It's a naive recreation of our current world, but with robots. And you see, quite vividly and comedically, that life as we know it today does not map directly onto robots, and it would be absurd if it did. There are inefficiencies that we have. There are things that we do that are illogical, that are not mechanical, right? That just don't really make sense when mapped onto robots. There's a ton of this throughout the whole movie. Most of the jokes in the movie fall into this category. It's mostly this absurdist kind of thing of, why would there be such a robot, or why would a robot need to do this? That kind of a thing. Some highlights for me, I really like. There's a scene later on when Rodney's repairing a robot, and he replaces the nose light of a robot, a little light bulb in the nose. We'll talk more about why robots look like humans in a minute here. He replaces that with a new light bulb that turns out to be a clap light, and it won't come on at first, and he claps, and the light comes on, they give a high five, and then the light goes out. I love this because it's evoking a very particular piece of technology. The clap light is in the realm of the infomercial, right? Talk about technology with sort of dubious usefulness or something along those lines. Technology that's kind of this weird novelty in 2005, essentially, being mapped onto this world, how goofy it is that the clap light makes an appearance. We have other examples, right, at a cafe, right? Rodney's dad, Herb, works at a cafe. Robots eat, apparently, doesn't really make any sense. Later on, we see a robot toilet. Absurdism. Like I said, inefficiency and technology kind of coming together. That's a huge, huge theme of this movie, and it's the absurdist logic of the film. At the same time, however, it wouldn't be right to say that this movie is simply lampooning technology, or that it is a love letter to the analog. Because at the same time, we see a lot of novel things. We see a lot of ideas that are clever at the very least, or maybe even cool, right? When Herb is bringing up Rodney as a young child, we see that there's a little volume control that he can turn down the crying on his baby at one point, right? We see Rodney learning to walk with training wheels. In some ways, these things might seem kind of similar to what I was just describing, but there's a little bit of spark of cleverness in it. They're very similar, but there's a little bit of a clever element. It's not just, clearly a robot can't do this. Clearly, there's some boundary on what makes sense to automate, right? On some aspects of the human life, on some aspects of adolescence, of growing up, there are some things that don't make sense to turn to make mechanical. That's one aspect of it, but at the same time, there's a little bit of a cleverness that does allude to some spark of technology, some interest in technology, right? That is, like I said, is clever and perhaps even alluring or enticing to some degree, even if we don't seriously consider the possibility that we might have volume control on our kids at one point. Of course, when we get to Robot City, we really get more of this. It's supposed to be exciting. It's supposed to be a cool place. It's this big, burgeoning metropolis with all kinds of interesting things happening and all kinds of cool, exciting things. It seems to me that there's a heavy amount of Star Wars influence in this film, and when we get to Robot City, we see some of that. We see it looking like Cloud City or like Coruscant, I guess, is the city from the early movies or whatever, the planet that's all city or something. It really evokes that to me. It really looks like that. Interesting piece of trivia is that this movie, Robots, was the first film to feature to have the trailer for Star Wars Episode 3 played before it. And when it came out, there were lots of Star Wars fans who flocked to the theaters just to watch the trailer, and of course to listen to the voice of Rodney as well. But some Star Wars influence or whatever, and that is another aspect of futurism, right? Star Wars is not about lampooning this, like, the technological folly going too far with futurism or something. No, it's interesting, it's inspiring, it's cool, it's clever. The future things. Of course, Star Wars isn't in the future, it's in the distant past. But perhaps it's all the same. Anyway, we can go even further because there's even more obvious ways in which the film is invested in some kind of not absurdist, but rather some sort of novel or some sort of slick futurism, something more optimistic than the absurdism, right? Rodney is an inventor in this film. He is personally invested in the logic of the future, in futurism. He is inspired by the Big World TV show to make things, to come up with new ideas. The Big World TV show, they look for new ideas. That's the currency of innovation, supposedly. The new idea. We've seen this all throughout history, the idea of the inventor, which, you know, is something you want to do as a kid. When you grow up, you realize that invention doesn't really exist on its own. Exactly. It's maybe a sort of a corporate research thing is a thing in the world, but what is invention? What is a new idea? An idea that's just like so strikingly good it can stand on its own, that the new idea, the idea itself, is almost an object, right? Some sort of currency or something like that. Well, in this movie, we sort of perpetuate that idea, and through that, we get this idea of inclusivity and merit, something transcendental, where you can get out of Rivet Town and go to the big city, make something of your life just by having a good idea. Old school American capitalism, in other words, right? And so the film is definitely not just saying, okay, technology is goofy, let's not try to overuse technology, use it where it doesn't make sense. You know, maybe it says that in some ways. Maybe a lot of the jokes are looking at the absurdist nature of a technological future. But on the other hand, the film is completely bought into this idea of transcendental ideas, merit through new ideas, through invention, through futurism. That is kind of the linchpin of the film. Okay, so it's a very classic American capitalist thing in some ways. On the other hand, it's completely different, right? We'll talk about the right to repair, some of the anti-capitalist sentiments later on. For now, all I'll say is that we have a conspicuous view of labor relations from the beginning of the film. For instance, when Rodney was a young boy, it turned out his dad took him to the city to see a parade, to see a marching band or whatever. Anyway, they go and they see a marching band, and there's a robot there that is the bass drum. And it's just continually being pounded. It's the bass drum. Like I said, we get a conspicuous look at some sort of arbitrary class and labor relations. Okay, what is this kick drum? It's just born into being a bass drum, and it's just destined to being hit forever and ever until the end of its life or something like that. That's, like I said, conspicuously arbitrary. Herb, right, is a dishwasher again. You know, where does that come from? And he even has sort of a sob story about how he wanted to be a musician, but ended up as a dishwasher. He swapped his parts for something more practical, right? So we'll get into the class view a lot more in a little bit. But like I said from the beginning, labor relations conspicuously on show. And you can see why I say this is a complicated movie, because already in the first few minutes of the film, before we've gotten to Robot City or anything like that, we've already seen the absurdism of technology, we've already seen the allure of technology, and we've already seen some of the societal complexities of technology. Interesting. So, toys. When we get to the city, first of all, we get to the city via an airship. Oh, an airship. That's so interesting. So, airship, of course, will evoke Miyazaki. This movie is in the Spectre. There's a little bit of a Spectre of anime cast over this movie in some ways. Fender, Robin Williams' character, has a line where he asks somebody to to depict him with big anime eyes or something. Anime is directly referenced in the film and also indirectly referenced perhaps through some of the stylistic turns. Maybe Hollywood animation was a bit spooked in 2005 as anime was catching on or something like that. But the airship, of course, is also hugely historically significant, right? The airship, a very bougie way. The airship, basically a continuation of kind of the old school version of the cruise ship, like the cruise line, right? Like the Olympic or the Titanic even, right? And kind of this like luxury kind of thing also gone. So one other thing you might point out about the airship, of course, is that doesn't seem much like the future. And of course, this film does have some element of retrofuturism. It has some steampunk elements going on, the airship, right? Some of the ways the robots look in the inner city and things. So, okay, you might say, that ain't future. That isn't the future at all. This is partly the past. Whether or not that negates some of the ideas about futurism in the film is kind of another question. But I'll leave that to you. Anyway, point is, it's quite an interesting tableau we get coming from River Town on an airship into Robot City. Yeah, it's interesting. And pencil in some ideas about the airships that were once, flying into New York, about airships in war, about the Hindenburg. Anyway, I don't want to make this video extremely long, so I'm not going to fill in the rest of the details on the airship, but just very interesting. Anyway, so Rodney shows up in Robot City, which, again, there's just so many interesting things that happen immediately. I'm going to skip over all of them. If I were watching this movie with you, I'd want to pause it like every 2 seconds and point out some interesting little thing that they've stuck in. When we get to Robot City, we see homelessness. We see panhandling robots. This is partly some absurdism, again, because what is the efficiency of a panhandling robot in this technological society where things are all put together? Why are there people that are, not cogs in the machine exactly? Or is the homeless person, the panhandling robot, one of these cogs in an essential part of presenting the city? Interesting question. You wonder about the human cost of homelessness as well, the loss of dignity and such, the hunger. Do robots feel those things? Unclear. Perhaps even more subtle. Well, the homeless robot is not subtle exactly, but one kind of funny thing that happens immediately afterwards is that they bump. There's a gag about a metal detector where a robot has to go through a metal detector to get on the airship, and of course the robot's made out of metal, so it steps through once and the metal detector goes off and it pulls off one arm and puts it in the bin, pulls off another arm, puts it in the bin, pulls off the legs, puts it in the bin, then puts himself in the bin and someone else pushes him through. Keep in mind, this was 2005, 4 years after 9/11, when most of those security things would have really come to the fore. It's interesting to see that kind of joke in the movie, querying whether or not this is security theater to some degree. It's also interesting that I believe the metal detector is not a robot in this film, which is interesting because it is a mechanical device. There's a lot of other interesting things about Robot City I can go through really quickly. For instance, that we have the conflation of the inside and the outside. That's one sort of common thing in the technological utopia, is that the interior and the exterior are sort of blended together often. You get this, again, with the train station sort of indoors, sort of outdoors and such, and it's never really clear. It seems like everything might be inside. Clearly, though, the kind of pinnacle of this arrival is the Crosstown Express. So this is the sort of train that they take to get to, that Rodney takes to try and get to Big Weld Industries. So here, the Crosstown Express is evocative of a Marble Run, essentially. And this is one of the first places where you realize, or where I realized at least, that the film really has a heavy toy influence. And that we get this tons and tons later on. We get wind-up cars. We get a huge domino metaphor in this movie. You see it again and again and again. But here we've got a Marble Run, and we also have a couple of specific components in the Marble Run that are like literal toys. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with those certain toys where it's like the little wheel that goes on a track up and down, and it sort of rides up and then back down, and the track is just like two pieces of wire that are angled in such a way that the motion of the wheel is slightly counterintuitive. I think the ends are magnetic as well. Anyway, that's shown basically exactly just like it's mimicked, it's duplicated in the film. And you start to wonder, why was this movie called Robots and not Toys? That's a very interesting question that I think something to ponder. Why was the movie called Robots when it could have been called Toys in some ways? But it's interesting because the toy dynamic in some ways pushes back on the absurdist idea, right? I came out, full steam ahead saying that this film is mainly kind of, most of the jokes are absurdist. They're poking fun at technology being everywhere. But on the other hand, You could imagine a kid watching the movie and interpreting the film as, whoa, look, it's toys. What if they remade the world out of toys? Wouldn't that be fun and cool and sort of funny, right? That has a very, very different connotation than what if we remade the world out of robots? Wouldn't that be kind of ridiculous and inhuman, right? Two very different ways of viewing the film. And of course, kids are the real audience for this movie. On the other hand, some of the absurdities just seem to ring so true. For instance, we are right now in an era of absurd transport, right? You look at the Boring Company, for instance, digging tunnels under cities to have individual cars go through a subway tunnel, essentially, and selling that via a futurist vision, right? Selling that as the next big thing, even though it obviously isn't. Well, this track with individual cars, individual pods going down it, is a bit like the Marble Run in some ways. There's another sidebar here I'm not going to get into this video, but you look at Tesla in particular compared to this movie, compared to Big Weld, for instance, compared to Disney, Elon Musk, all those things. Interesting thing. Like I said, I just don't have time to get into it for this movie. I got to point out, as a film person, that in this Marble Run scene, we get there's one part of the Marble Run where there's a pipe with holes on the side, and you get the view from each pipe, and it creates like the stop motion effect. And I just got to give the old zoetrope shout out or something sort of equivalent to a zoetrope with the film, calling back to the original methods of animation and the moving image. Kind of interesting. Okay. It's a complicated movie, and we just gotta soldier right on with one of the more complicated themes of the film, which is the idea of mimicry. Right? Why do robots in the movie look like humans? What does it mean to be sentient in the universe of the film? Consider the little pet that Rodney builds. Right? So for those of you. Well, I'm assuming if you made it this far, you probably know something about the movie. But at one point, Rodney in the beginning builds this little helper robot to help out with the dishes. This is a perplexing thing. First of all, very significant that this problem, this is like classic little capitalist innovation thing. Like I said, the film is invested in the idea of innovation, in the idea of ideas, right? In the idea of saving labor and things like that, right? Rodney, as the protagonist, to show how clever he is and such, builds this little robot that helps his dad do the dishes and such, right? He doesn't question the labor relations of his dad as a dishwasher. He wants to make a device that will save his dad time. Very interesting, even though he comes so close to some of the themes about the sort of profound arbitrary nature of the way that work is set up in this world and perhaps in our world, right? If he's building another person to do the dishes or something like that, that is essentially, it is another sentient being that's going to take his dad's job, make it easier for him. Is there any change in the labor situation? Because now you're taking this task that was his dad didn't like or whatever, and you're giving it to another sentient thing. It's just another person doing it, basically, right? That's profoundly different from restructuring the way that the labor is divided or questioning the inherent, why do we even need to wash the dishes in the first place? They're robots. Like, what are they even eating? Instead, we have sort of the capitalist innovation that is not a refactoring of labor relations, but just sort of another labor innovation or whatever. So interesting. But to get back to the question of sentience, I mean, this thing is subhuman, essentially. It's this little thing that Rodney builds is not viewed as a human robot, whatever that means. It's not like a first-class robot like Rodney is, all these ones that are evocative of humans. Instead, it is a pet robot. And in some ways, the metaphor kind of makes sense because it's like, Herb and I forget Rodney's mother's name, but Herb and his wife, they make Rodney. And that's, it's like having a son, and then the son makes this thing that's a pet, and he has a pet. Okay, that makes perfect sense. On the other hand, like a child creating life out of nothing, and life that is sort of fundamentally in the same taxonomy as himself, right? I mean, there really is very little that separates this little doohickey that washes the dishes from any of the other robots in the film. Yet, Rodney is not the robot's father, it's its owner, right? So the idea of what sentience is and where the boundary between life is And which robots are the adult and like human robots, and which robots are the pet robots. Fascinating stuff. And you might say, who cares? These are just inconsistencies of the film. But I think there's a lot to think about in here in terms of the blurring of the lines in the taxonomy of automated things that might be coming to a theater near you. It might be coming to our world before long as more and more things become automated. It's interesting, too, that in this movie there's some things that don't even merit an identity. Like I said, the metal detector, I don't believe was a robot. The hinges on the doors, they're not robots. So it's not every mechanical thing that is a robot. On the other hand, we see time and time again things that you wouldn't expect to be a robot that are, like the lamppost or something. And most of these are jokes, like, oh, yeah, turns out it's a robot, right, is a joke used many, many times throughout the film, like when there's a riot or protest at one point, and somebody goes to throw a garbage can, and it turns out the garbage can is a robot. He says, hey, put me down. Interesting. It's possible that personality is the thing, right? Personality is important here. That separates the mechanical from the human in some ways, right? The pet also has personality, but it's sort of a different type of thing. The pet doesn't talk. That's one thing that's significant, maybe. The pet just sort of tries to signal, and it communicates, but it doesn't talk. So that maybe that's the difference between, like I said, a pet robot and a human robot is personality, and the personality is the currency, which is extremely interesting. Maybe it's just something to do with what they look like, right? It's an extremely loose mimicry. You know, the human robots, they have faces and such. Why would a robot have a face? Who knows? It doesn't make any sense in some ways. On the other hand, robots that are being made today in the real world, they have personalities, right? We have the Alexa and such. We have Siri. These are things that are designed to be human-like, right? So, like I said, it might seem like this is just sort of one of the quirks of the movie, but in fact, even in the real world, we're already starting to blur the lines, and we're already starting to get a bit confused as to which things are real. Not literally confused, but like I said, it is an interesting question of why robots should evoke humans at all, both in the movie and in the real world. Like I said, personality is a big part of it, but the personality aspect in this movie is also completely baffling. What does it mean for a robot to have a personality? These robots are mass-produced, right? Big Weld in the film is the best robot in the world. They say that numerous times, right? There is only one Big Weld, totally unique. At the same time, who made him, right? The robots in this film are seemingly mass-produced. They're seemingly produced by Big Weld Industries or something along those lines, right? You see at the end of the day that Big Weld presents Herb with some of his parts, and he says, I brought enough boxes to make 2 more of you or something, and he brings a box that says Herb on it, and it's the Herb robot or whatever. So apparently everybody has their own unique personality that, since this is like a kid's Disney film, basically, the personality is key, the uniqueness is key or whatever. But on the other hand, these things are all mass-produced, and this, of course, is, again, not just a quirk of the movie, but is something that is profoundly applicable to our life. Like I say, Siri and Alexa, these things that supposedly have some semblance of personality, but are mass-produced. Interesting. So like I said, a loose mimicry is complicated. That's the easy part, is the mimicry. The more complicated part is the hyper-real aspect. My favorite character in this film, I think, is the robot toilet. Partly because this robot toilet in the movie has a nasally voice. A nasally voice that kind of evokes a toilet. It's like, yeah, if a toilet could talk, it would probably sound like that. And in doing this, I love it when this happens. Like, it's basically a kid's movie partaking in bullying, right? Because, of course, there are people out there who have that sort of a voice. It's like, okay, we telling people that their kind of nasally, like, nerd-esque voice sounds like a toilet or whatever. Like, that's kind of weird. But that's, the toilet has so much more going for it. For one thing, it's just a great piece of absurdism, right? Of course, there's a robot toilet, but do robots use the toilet? And if they do use the toilet, then how does the robot toilet use the toilet? And why does the robot toilet walk around instead of being in one place? Are people just using the robot toilet anytime or whatever? Doesn't really make any sense. But it's there as the absurdist logic, right? There's some sort of completion. Like I said, there's many, many jokes in this movie that's like, oh, turns out it's a robot. So there's this sort of carpeting of our world in the robotic world. More and more avenues are explored, and you get sort of more humorous mimicry, where it is a toilet. The thing that's so interesting about the mimicry of the toilet is that the toilet is hardly a real thing in the first place. I don't mean that toilets don't exist, but I mean that a toilet isn't exactly a natural thing. It doesn't come from the world. There's no transcendental truth of the toilet. It's something created arbitrarily, more or less, by man. It's mechanical in the first place. It's also iconic, right? You think about the toilet logo on the restroom or something like that. An incredibly potent symbol known all across the world, but it's not a natural thing. It's not a real thing. So here in the film, we are mimicking the man-made artifact. And we start maybe a little bit just to lose track of what was even real in the first place, right? We begin to mimic things that were themselves mimicry. And this is where we come into the hyper real to some extent, right? The idea of the simulacra, the replication without an original, right? The duplicate without an original. And there's a range of this, right? So there are some things that are concrete. I'm not telling you that toilets don't exist. I'm not telling you that lampposts don't exist, but they are constructed things, and it is a little bit odd to repeat them out of this comfort, to repeat them in the robotic world. Now, there are other things that are abstract. This is where the crux of it really is. For instance, at one point, Fender pretends to be some sort of foreign prince. He gives us the robotic spin on the foreign prince. Okay, he's got this big accent. He's got this sort of over-the-top cape and thing. Well, the thing about that is that the foreign prince is not real and never was real. The foreign prince is a concoction of Hollywood and such, particularly the over-the-top one. Now, you might say, of course, Napoleon was real. There were foreign princes like this, but there's a big difference between the historical reality of things and the sort of created character, the over-the-top thing. And it's not just a difference in one being kind of over-the-top or the other one, but there's a difference in one of them being kind of a cultural image, something held, that is essentially kind of made up, propagated through Disney films and such as the Prince, right? So we get the robotic version of the Prince. We make the symbolic into the concrete in some ways. We get the copy of the thing that was never real in the first place. And you look, like I said, partly this is just a quirk of the film, but partly I think there's a profound element of our real life here. As we look for the comforting embrace of the familiar through mimicry, by remaking the things that are in the world right now, do we lose track of the real as we just copy and copy and copy? Like I said, it's kind of the fundamental logic of the film is copying things over from today's life into the robotic domain. And we've seen kind of how arbitrary that can be when you through the question of why robots should look like humans and such. And so these are, I think, very concrete things. And when we start talking about robots that do have a personality, we have to begin asking ourselves questions about whether or not we are, again, copying something that was never real in the first place. Getting back to the robot toilet, we get one of the best examples of this by far. So in the film, at one point, we see restrooms, and they've got a male and a female plug on the front. So we still have the gender binary in this world. And if you want something that's abstract and arbitrary in this world, but has been copied over into the technological world, basically for a sense of comfort, for some familiarity, there's no better example than gender, right? Why on earth would robots be gendered, right? It literally makes no sense whatsoever. And yet it's been copied over, a copy without an original, right? Make something concrete based on a symbol that is kind of arbitrary from the first place. Some people would say that this movie is a subversive take on gender. And that's a workable point. I don't think it's super strong. It could be. I mean, the question for me is the film lampooning gender, the arbitrary nature of it, or is it lavishing in gender stereotypes? Maybe it could be doing both. Maybe there's a spectrum. But there's a lot of one-dimensional things in this movie. For instance, Rodney's mom. So one-dimensional, I can't even remember her name. Aunt Fanny, Cappy, Piper, Ratchet's domineering mother. Ratchet, by the way, great name, cinematic and mechanical etymology of that name. The women's roles in this movie really suck, basically. There are also romantic plot lines that come out of nowhere. There's couple formation that comes out of nowhere at the end of the movie. Everyone's sort of, hooking up. Like Rodney's got a girlfriend, Big Weld's got a girlfriend. It doesn't really make any sense. That logic of couple formation is a hallmark of classic Hollywood, and it's kind of ironic sometimes when people complain about like how cheesy the love stories are in old movies. Well, 2005 kids movie doing exactly the same thing. That doesn't mean that it's like good in old movies or that it's good now or anything. But like I said, for people who are saying that this is a super subversive movie in the way it looks at gender, well, there's a bit of a stumbling block in all these super one-dimensional things. Now, you might say that the idea of this is that the movie is trying to show how arbitrary it all is. Maybe. On the other hand, they mostly play these things comedically. They mostly go for the jokes. They mostly seem to lavish in the stereotypes. That's the way I see the film, honestly. There is a couple scenes where Fender does some cross-dressing. Could this be some sort of subversive thing? Maybe. I don't really think so, though, honestly. It seems more like they've just set Robin Williams free, and he's just gone into the sound booth and done a whole bunch of really off-the-wall stuff, and then they've animated to it. And that includes dabbling in all sorts of racial impersonations, putting on all kinds of accents, and a bit of cross-dressing. But hugely subversive film in that way? Well, I don't know. I don't really think so. But, like I said, interesting questions here about what exactly is real. In this movie, we lose track of the real, clearly, right? We lose track of what is alive and what's not. The lines are blurred there. We lose track of the difference between the purely mechanical, in between the pet, and in between the so-called human, or whatever. And that's interesting, and perhaps something to think about as our world becomes more and more technological, and we lean into robotics more and more. Okay. We also, of course, got to talk about the body in this film. So this very naturally follows from what we were just talking about with, like, okay, why do robots look like humans? Why are robots gendered? All these things. There's a slogan in the film. Why be you when you can be new, right? And this is kind of the classic Disney villain plotline in some ways, right? Where personality, be yourself, is kind of the calling card of these films, even though it's completely superficial in some ways, right? I mean, we already mentioned how this film heralds individuality, but at the same time, all the things are mass-produced. One very, very interesting piece of this movie, by the way, should have mentioned this earlier, but like I said, supposedly all these robots are mass-produced. You never see any duplicates, except the duplicated robots in this movie are the bad guys, right? It's the bad guys who all look the same and who are mass-produced, even though apparently the company actually mass-produces everyone, right? So it's a classic Disney maneuver of distancing themselves from mass production by stating the value of the individual, while at the same time making something, as in the movie, that is fundamentally mass-produced and homogenizing. Okay, anyway, the slogan for the villain is "Why be you when you can be new?" And here we see sort of the capitalist weaponization of this mimicry kind of thing and such, where it suddenly becomes hugely important or hugely politicized what you look like. The body itself, the pieces, the repairs, and such. Obvious parallel in this movie is the right to repair. I don't want to get into this too much because it's absolutely staring you in the face. But this is where the movie seems to have some sort of proletarian virtues to some extent, right? Talking about the right to repair. The right to repair becomes more and more significant as tech becomes more intimate, surely, right? When the copy machine breaks at your workplace in 1985 and you bring in a technician to fix it, who cares, man? Like, whatever. It's under warranty. The licensed repair person comes out from the thing. Doesn't really matter. It's impersonal. When your personal computer breaks down and the technician has to fix it, has to look through your files to do some of those things, when your phone has to be sent away and your phone's not with you and it's perhaps being looked at by somebody else, that's another thing. Or when you're being forced to upgrade or something like that, when you're being forced to change part of the digital landscape inside of your head, right? Your home is as much your apartment as it is your computer and such. And when you are being forced to upgrade or something like that, to move from one version to another, or when you're being forced to hand off that technology to somebody else, that's much more intimate. But believe me, it's nothing like when you are a robot and your parts are no longer being made. Interesting lesson from the film. The right to repair becomes more significant as tech becomes more intimate. There's power in the manufacturer, right? When there's a monolithic manufacturer, when everybody's being made by the same person, as it seems in this movie that all the robots are being made by Big Weld Industries. When Big Weld Industries stops putting out new parts for people, they're all screwed, right? When you're not in control of the means of production, and the means of production are inherently linked to yourself, right? When it's your own parts, that's a big problem. So is the movie saying seize the means of production? Well, in some ways it is, right? Rodney goes and he starts remaking. He starts helping people out. He starts repairing. He's a guerrilla repairman, Louis Rossmann of the robot world, in as such, right? A hero for the people. Of course, let's point out that Rossmann Repairs is an unashamedly capitalist business, but the right to repair angle is pretty clear. On the other hand, is this actually an anti-capitalist movie? No, it isn't. What's the resolution to this whole thing? It's not that repairs are democratized. It's not that people regain control of their bodies, right? Instead, they find Big Weld, they seek out, there's this father figure that comes back, this guide that comes back and reinstates the benign traditional American capitalism in some ways. And it is absolutely no coincidence that this paternal figure, Big Weld, the capitalist, the father figure, the guide, is, of course, none other than Walt Disney, right? None other than the sort of supposedly benign mainstream. It seems kind of bizarre to me that some people would claim that this is an anti-capitalist movie. I mean, like I said, it does make the motions at the time. It is a proletarian movie in some ways, but the resolution clearly is capitalist, but it's kind of heartwarming Walt Disney capitalism, which, like I said, claims to put individuality first, right? Claims to do all these, put things all back in their right places. But as we know, it doesn't do that at all. Like I said, it's homogenizing. At the end of the day, what does Big Weld bring to Rivertown? Well, he brings some boxes of Rodneys. He brings the mass-produced parts. Interesting. A couple more themes to just briefly touch on that I didn't have time to go into. One of them is nationalism in the film. Fender briefly alludes, perhaps in jest, to entering the country. He had to change his name when he came to the country. Okay. Countries in this, very interesting. What does a country look like in the robots universe? The country, in some ways, is opposed to the technological, right? The multinational corporation effaces the country. It makes the country obsolete. It creates new boundaries, new borders that are not national, right? That are extra-national, international. And in this movie, it kind of seems, it's a classic thing in kids' movies or whatever, or even most movies, that there's really only one place that's in the country and one place that is there's one rural area, and then there's one big city or whatever. And the world is basically entirely reduced to that. You don't know too much more about the other things, but you do really wonder what government looks like. That's another extremely, extremely interesting part of this movie, by the way, is that there is no government. Supposedly, for people who are claiming that this is an anti-capitalist movie, right, about seizing the means of production, where's the government, right? Nowhere. The people that will help you out are the benign capitalists, right? It's Walt Disney. You don't need government. You need Walt Disney. He'll build a planned community for you. It'll be a utopia. Obviously, complete garbage. Hey, you don't like the labor relations? Why don't you live in Disneyland? Of course, Disneyland doesn't pay its workers. Interesting. But no countries, no governments, except there is one brief allusion to a country. Very interesting. Okay, dominoes is another theme in the film that comes again and again. Some people, are they going to jump to some sort of half-baked conclusion about the domino effect and communism? Maybe, I don't know. But it's interesting, filed under toyification. I think I'd have to think a little bit more about dominoes in this movie, though. The final thing to mention is the effacement of race in the film. Ooh, interesting. So there isn't really race amongst the robots, but there are many racial elements in this film. There is black singing and dancing. Some of the robots are break dancers and such. Some of the robots sing soul music, or there's some like rapping and such. Very interesting. A recombination of racial elements. Is this an allusion to a future where racial identity is decoupled from experience, where these things are repurposed as entirely superficial markings, things that are just, used to buy and sell, where the symbol is completely democratized and completely disconnected from its original sort of experiential meaning? Perhaps. Anyway, that's some ideas about robots, hopefully not too wildly disjointed. Some of these themes are sort of complicated, but to go briefly back over some of the ideas, like I said, different types of futurism. We have, in some ways, a very absurdist film, but in other ways, a film that actually is buying into the allure of the future. And you look at the particular futurism that Big Weld represents, both when you look at the Big Weld television show, the inventing, and of course, given the fact that Big Weld eventually comes back in the movie and makes everything good, and the movie there basically totally invests itself in Big Weldian future, the Disney future, right? Disneyland, essentially. You look at toys, okay, it's all that now. There's much more of a connection there, I guess, perhaps, between the slick futurism and toys. The kid watching this movie in awe, thinking, wow, that's what the future could be like. How different is that from the adult looking at the Cybertruck, at Tesla things, at, drones that can carry people in the future, and things like that, and thinking, wow, right, toys for adults. What does that mean? Again, what an interesting question. Why is this movie called Robots and not Toys? Then we got into some of the more complicated things about mimicry and the hyperreal, right? What's the boundary between the adult robots, the pet robots, and things that are not robots at all? What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be human? These lines get blurred all over the place. And to go alongside that, we in this movie have concrete examples, copies of things that were not real in the first place, things that we latch onto that are familiar, but that were always arbitrary and such. And in talking about that, we come to gender, and talking about that, we come to the body, and we see that this mimicry is inherently personal, that it defines who we are and how we live our lives. Interesting to think about. Then we got briefly into some of the political aspects of it, right, with the right to repair and the proletariat. There's some working class themes in this movie, but is it an anti-capitalist movie? Almost certainly not. Instead, it has you bow down to the church of Walt Disney, which is homogenizing, which is mass-produced, much like the robots in the movie. So, like I said, I feel like there's so much more I could go into about this, but that's a little bit of food for thought regarding robots from 2005.